So, so just so you know, you got on the right bus. We're at Depression and Suicide, Balancing Risk and Finding Hope and Connection. And what I really do hope at the end of this is that you have found some hope as a community of learners together, and some connection, because we will be doing some talking together about cases. And already you've done your homework, because I read the pieces that you've written about turnaround kids, which I'm going to share at the end or intersperse in between. And I was really, really inspired. You know, you all, if we took in this room, we probably have close, I can't do math, someone else might be better at that, but we probably have about 2,000 years of experience. And for those of you at home, also, we could probably add in another 1,000, so, or at school. So just take a moment to think about that. In this room, the wisdom that you bring to this. Now, I'm just learning how to do this. I go like that. Oops. Okay. It didn't seem to work, you guys. Oh, yeah, you did. Ha, technology is alive and well. So just to give you a little bit of my background, I know Margie introduced us, but I also want to give you my sort of street cred, right? Part-time associate professor just doesn't cut it when you're thinking about street cred. And I worked for 23 years in a school-based health center. Hi, Devin. She was one of my colleagues, a school psychologist who helped me out last time. So, I also wrote a book called The Behavior Code, which was because you all know we're losing 25% of our teachers, 25% of our teachers in the first 5 years. So I just saw that there's been, something's gone viral where a teacher left to go work for Costco and she thought that was an upgrade. That's not good, right? I'm not dissing Costco, but I would like to think that being a teacher, you know, has a passion and fuels us, but there's been a lot of challenges with that. And so the behavior code was looking at kids with oppositional behavior, kids with anxious behavior, kids with sexualized behavior, which if you want the fastest out of district placement, you have kids with sexualized behavior, and kids that are depressed. So I've been thinking about this for a long time, and I'm a marathon runner. So we're on a marathon a little bit because we have 2 hours together. And I hold both. I work with public sector, and I've taught Harvard freshmen for the last 20 years, teaching on psychiatry and memoir. So I also, some of you may have seen me wearing the hat of doing safety assessments and teaching about safety assessments. So those are what some people like to call threat assessments. I prefer to put the emphasis on safety assessments, and I would encourage when you're reaching out to families. So those are the kids that are escalated, that you may be worried about a school shooting, or some just have a volatility that's making it hard for students to learn. And so that's, and that was my virtual hug to those of you who are somewhere else, not here with us. And what are we looking at here? This is a family portrait of my first family. It is 6 kids, and I'm the youngest of the 6 children in this picture. So I'm in my grandmother's lap, and it's 1962, and my mother died by suicide in 1963. And I was the youngest at that point of 6 children. My dad remarried to a woman who had 3 children, then they had 2 children, so I grew up in a family of 11 children. In my family, suicide wasn't talked about. I didn't see pictures of my mother. This is later that I found this, after I was 30, and after I had my first child, who's now 32, and I'm a proud grandmother. And to show my love for MPY, I spoke here 1 week after my daughter gave us a grandchild. So I wrote a memoir called In Her Wake, A Child Psychiatrist Explores the Mystery of Her Mother's Suicide, and ended up sort of being inadvertently a beacon of hope for families who've lost someone to suicide, and have worked over the last 20 years with families who've lost someone to suicide. So my passion really comes because I don't want any family to suffer this loss. Because when one person dies by suicide, they used to say it was 6 people and that are impacted, and now they say 70 people. So some of you may have lost someone in your own school community to suicide. And we have, my mother disappeared. I don't know why we got a picture of a lake, but I hope that's where she is. Yeah, so just to give you the sense of how, even just on a daily basis, I end up running into topics of suicide. Am I allowed to try this and see if something happens? Well, I'm just going to tell you what you're looking at that you're not looking at, but it's a it's a picture of a roller coaster, because you may have experienced, when you have a suicidal or depressed patient, that there's a lurching feeling. The day that I don't have a sense of being on high alert with a wise mind, yeah, I got that lingo down, is the day I should get out of the work I do, right? Each of us knows that when you're sitting with a teenager that is suffering, with this teenager that usually is longing for something different and looking, as DBT language says, a life worth living, that the despair may be a protest, but it's also a race against time. And we teeter, right? We teeter between being collaborative and then moving into an authoritative mode. And the collaboration, usually for me at least, happens when I feel like there's a glimmer of hope emanating from the student. And I think, okay, I can sit with this despair, but particularly if it's a student who's done actions to hurt themselves, I'm more likely to go into a control mode. So it's just important, I offer that language for you just to think about that in your mind, to be reflective of, there's our roller coaster, yay. Not really, I don't want to be on the roller coaster, but to be reflective of, when am I going into a, what's my threshold for control versus collaboration? And I strongly recommend, and I heard from one of the participants today, how important it is to have colleagues that support you, to have, particularly when you're dealing with suicidal patients, to have people on speed dial, sharing the responsibility. Sometimes with depressed kids, we worry alone. And to me, that's when mistakes happen. Mistakes that when you do a psychological autopsy, which means you go from the completed event and work backwards, you can see there might have been times when, if a counselor or a therapist had shared their worry, there might have been some problem solving that comes. Because even though we are dedicated clinicians, sometimes you can hit a threshold where you go into freeze. So having a safety net, and as we're talking about, it's hard because right now our safety net sucks. And when you hit the threshold of really being worried that a child needs to be hospitalized, that safety net right now is a long, long pipeline. The other thing I would encourage when we're talking about depression and suicide is really remembering to keep track of the growth of our students. That, Bob Brooks loves to talk about islands of competency. And the healing process really requires that we keep that lens on the positive aspects of what that student has to offer, and that we figure out a way to highlight it. The kinds of things that I do to keep myself in the game are meditation, Pilates class, just started it in the last 5 years. I've been a marathon runner. I'm running a little bit less, cross-country skiing. But really, I ask you guys to take care of yourself. You are a precious resource, each one of you. I've already heard of some people who have stayed with a student and saved their life. If you do that once in your career, that is such a gift. And take care of yourself today, because there may be things I'm bringing up, and just do what you need to do, because I don't know how to be superficial. I might get born in another life, where I can just kind of ride it out, but hasn't, it's like I also have this idea that I'm going to someday be reborn as shy, and I don't know. So what are we going to cover today? I'm really hoping the parts where I am talking at you are going to be just for like 35 minutes, okay? And then we're going to have some cases where we're going to do some case-based discussion at the table and have some interaction. That's my goal. So if we get to 10:20, I'm going to stop myself. Then I'm going to say, let's take a 5-minute, I'm going to tell you the case, take a 5-minute break, come back, talk about the case, and then we'll keep rolling. We have 3 cases, but I got ahead of myself. Okay, the first thing we're going to be talking about is how to assess depressed or suicidal students. Oh, shoot. Wait a sec, you guys. I just did this, but it didn't. Oh, there we go. Okay. Sorry. I'm trying to make it go back and to show the bullets, but it's not doing that, you guys. Yeah, there you go. If you can, as I'm saying that, press it, because it's not, how to assess depressed or suicidal students, how to troubleshoot with parents and students, how to treat depressed students, and how to validate to de-escalate a student. And we're going to have a chance to think about that in small groups. Okay, next. What schools see, we know all too well. Kind of things we see: distraction, drop in grades, defiance, sulking, variable academic performance, stealing, lack of motivation, tardiness in school, absence. One thing I want to highlight around stealing: the biggest way a depressed kid can piss off a school system. Someone just give me a shot at it. I need engagement here, just a little bit of juice. What do you think's the fastest thing that a kid can do to really piss off a school? Anybody?
Vandalize something.
Vandalize. Okay, good. What would they vandalize? What do you think? What would really upset people? Bathrooms. Yeah, that's a good one. Vandalizing bathrooms. The one that I've seen is a teacher who has really invested in a depressed student, and then the student steals the cell phone of the teacher, or steals something from that teacher. And the teacher feels devastated and like they've been taken advantage of, that they've, and I think it's because many times teachers don't understand the concept of disorganized attachment, and the fact that, and so I think that's a really important thing to help teachers understand, that 80% of kids who've been abused have disorganized attachment, which means that it doesn't make sense to the people in the outside world. And I like to think about, in terms of stealing, it's like Winnicott, D.W. Winnicott, the psychoanalyst from Britain, he talks about you steal because of the love that you think you deserve. And so that it actually, if you say it that way, then you can think about the idea that it's not that the kid is being quote unquote manipulative or trying to get attention, but they're looking for attachment. And it just can shift how you have the restorative justice discussion and think about it. So I think of each of you guys as ambassadors. You're going to be, hopefully, take my slides. I'm happy to have you use them whatever way are useful, providing training for your staff administrators and on-site based educating parents, which I think is super important around mental health and suicide risk. And in thinking about, and these, I'm listing these because these are roles you might be doing inventory. Are we doing this in our schools? You know, involving students in health promotion and suicide prevention efforts. It's a hot one, not always done. I would be interested, how many of you are screening kids for depression or suicide in this district? So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 people. So that's a hot button one, right? Because if you screen, a lot of districts do it after a suicide, because then they're like, holy shit, I don't want a suicide again, let me screen. People prior to suicide happening feel like if I do it, then I identify kids at risk, and then I have to manage them all. And so, you know, it's a struggle. And then, of course, some of us have been, I know I probably had about 10 suicides I've been involved with in schools where it's after the suicide that you support a community. Next. So I just want you for a moment, just in your mind, to take a kid that you're working with right now and just hold on to them during this session, okay? And what I would ask for my own sustenance is if you could hold on to it, and if there's anything today that you take home that's going to help you with that student, I'm going to ask us at the end if you're willing to share that. Or that, or just a teaching point that you might take home to your district. That's called reinforcement, right? Okay. You know, I just recently, and he gave me permission to share, it's a different name, and always when I give cases, it's sort of, I've removed so you can't identify who the person is, but I asked permission about whether I can share. A 16-year-old, the one that I've been thinking about is a high school junior who was doing well academically, was a power lifter, and freshman year was remote learning, started to have anxiety attacks this year, started to have school avoidance, and there's been some family tension because of an imminent loss of his grandmother, and he reports feeling outside of himself. So I'll come back to him at the end. Next. How to assess depressed or suicidal patients. Next, please. So we already heard next by the numbers that 13% of teenagers have had a major depression episode in the last year, 1 out of 10 kids. And 11% had had substance abuse disorder in the past year. But what's really important is that more than 80% of teens improve with a combination of therapy and medication. And what we know is that substance abuse usually happens 2 years before, major depression usually happens 2 years before the substance abuse. So we have a window of opportunity. I still think it's scary that 1 in 5 teenagers think about suicide. 1 in 11 make suicide attempts. And there is a website called Handhold Mass, handholdma.org, handholdma.org. And if you look at it, you'll see there's a whole bunch of resources. And I think it's an acknowledgement that there's a bottleneck with both therapists and emergency rooms. And so I was looking at it yesterday, and Nandini Talwar, the woman I was telling you about who's head of DMH, has it under her letterhead And I think that's a brilliant idea, because if you have a parent that may email you, they might go to that and see all the resources. It's an idea I'm going to steal from her. But I think that the fact that more than 80% improve with therapy and medication is really important to communicate to our families. Okay, next. We all know what happens if depression is left untreated. It's a disaster. And one teaching point I want you all to highlight is 25% of children who are diagnosed with depression under 12 years old go on to have bipolar disorder. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind. And when I get to this next slide, which is the fact that a child with a depressed parent is 2 to 4 times more likely to develop depression before adulthood. And I think it's really important for us. I wish every kid had a learning passport, and every kid had a mental health passport. And part of their mental health passport would be about family history. And I don't think of it as destiny. Clearly I don't. I'm here. I had a mother that died by suicide. And I often, when I was a young kid, got scared, actually, when people would say, worrying that, am I going to make it past 33? So there's two messages you want to give kids who have family histories of, especially completed suicide, is it's a fairly low chance of a completed suicide in a child who's lost someone to suicide. It's a very low chance. I want to say it's 6 to 10,000 that die by suicide, and it's 12, so it's 2 times more likely than 10,000 that die by suicide. But it's still a small amount, and there are things that you can help people who have students who have family members with mental illness. One of the key things is, if we can do this, you all, it'll be so helpful, is help students know in a non-stigmatized way when they start to have symptoms that there's help. So if you know that there's a family member who's depressed, it is enormously helpful to think through what might show up in a kid's life. Because having worked in a school-based health center, I can tell you sometimes you found out about the depression after a student had made a suicide attempt. And they weren't talking with people about their symptoms. They just thought, I'm crazy. So really helping them to think that. And there's a researcher, Bill Beardsley, out of the Darkened Room, who talks about how he's out of Children's Hospital. And what he's worked with is families having a safety plan when a family member is struggling. So that I've had a very compelling case where a student was suicidal, but it was really because the mother was psychotic. So the way that he expressed it is, I want to put a knife in my heart. But it was because the psychosis wasn't speakable. It wasn't, and that was the work that I did with the family, was to help us get the parent the help that they needed. Next. So to other sources that you may know is NAMI, National Alliance of Mentally Ill, I think is a huge resource, and they have a really good program called Family to Family, which can help families that are struggling. And I think a great resource for family members who have a person in their family who is ignoring the fact, or no, has mind blindness. Maybe they're psychotic, or maybe they have substance abuse. The Xavier Amador, Amador, I'm Not Mentally Ill. He's a tremendous resource and really helpful for families. Okay, most of you all know the key signs of depression. but I think I'm just going to whip through this part really quickly, just as a way of being able to think about it if you're talking to parents or you're talking to kids. This is the way I've done it over the 30 years. When I talk about a change in sleep pattern, it's the idea that it's interfering with the function and they're not getting to school and they're getting tardies, or it's not sometimes that they're sleeping to 12 on a Saturday. You know, we have a lot of hypervigilant parents sometimes, and they can misinterpret the fact that their kids are growing 2 feet and that sleep is oxygen for some of these kids in terms of that. Interest is something that I see. The time I really perk up around decreased interest is when I have when I ask a teenager, have other peers noticed that you're not as interested? And I just had a student yesterday who talked about, you know, I can't even get out of my bed and go play Minecraft. And that's been sort of the juice for this particular student. So that decreased interest, I think, is a real flag. And decreased decreased interest in appetite. I just, with Max, he had stopped eating for 5 days and had lost about 10 pounds. And for me, when boys stop eating, unless they happen to be in crew or something where there's some rate restricting element that's going on, that is a super flag that we've moved into neurovegetative, meaning mind-body depression. And of course, suicidal irritability. I'm going to be talking about a 4th grader in our first case. And one of the things that is really important with younger kids is irritability and crankiness and tantrums every day. And 2 to 3% of children 6 to 12 years old have serious depression. So change in function is that is the way I talk with kids about it. If we're trying to figure out you're depressed, that's the, and I look at the severity of the symptoms and duration of sadness more than 2 weeks, and particularly with like 4 to 15, the somatic symptoms, the physical symptoms, the frequent visits to nurses. Is there any school nurse here? Ah, yes. God bless you. I worked with Tracy Rose, who is a beloved school nurse for 23 years. And school nurses are, a good school nurse is just life-saving. I've had, you know, when she was a nurse, well, she is still a nurse, but when I was working in the school-based health center, she had a student that came in with a headache and then ended up sharing that she had been looking online about how to kill herself. So that window of you being on the front line and, you know, catching a suicidal patient. And we know that from completed suicides, over 40% of those who've died by suicide have gone to see a primary care doctor. So there is a hope that people are gonna find, you know, sometimes there's a hope, there's an ambivalence that happens. Next slide. And then next slide. Next slide. This is just a reminder about the differential diagnosis. There are a lot of times where I'm treating depressed kids and subsequently I find out that they have ADD, and especially with girls, because girls are compliant, and it's only when the academic load gets stronger. So it's just a reminder to us to think about that with these kids and the learning disorder aspect of it. Next slide. So what I want to say about with which again you all might know, but with Schaffer's work, 75 to 90% of that was done in the 1980s, David Schaffer, and he did what are called psychological autopsies. Pretty brutal, but you work backwards. And 75 to 90% of suicides in teens have had a mental disorder for over a year. And that really changed the field in a way. I think people used to think about it as sort of existential angst. And I think what our job is to help kids generate alternatives so that they're not as attracted to death. And that's what I think. I think it's a failure of imagination, suicide. You know, I know there are all these sayings like, suicide is a permanent answer to a temporary problem. But it's, to me, it's the bleakness comes from tapping out of, not being able to tap in to each one of us who has a creative aspect of who we are. And so I just want to mention again, you all might know these. This is like doing a tune-up for you guys. The LGBT, the Trevor Project, I think has great resources. When you're thinking about suicide, of course, you want to look at earlier suicide attempts. You're much more likely, there's a 2-year vulnerability window where if you've made a suicide attempt, you want to think about it. You're at risk for the 2 years following in terms of the studies, and looking at the organized plan, the intent, and the preparation, and doing a chain analysis and how important that is, and definitely thinking about substance abuse, where you're 50% more likely to have a lethal attempt if substance abuse is on board. And I always try that whole idea about suicide is a permanent answer to a temporary problem. I always try to introduce with my suicidal teens about the idea of the temporary nature of it, and ask for time. I say, give us 3 months to see if we can turn this around. I mean, if you're dead, you're dead, but let's, and of course that puts the heat on us, but and the other thing that sometimes I'm asked about is teen clusters, and is this a cluster? Fortunately, maybe. Sometimes when someone dies by suicide in our community, it actually makes kids less likely to die by suicide because they see the impact on their community. And it is only 5% of teenage suicides are because of clusters. There was a lot of thought done by some of my colleagues at Stanford around Palo Alto because there was a uptick in persistent suicides. And, all right, if suicide's seen as a viable coping mechanism in a really wealthy community, they did a lot of self-reflection about the double talk that happens. Some of us are from districts that are very competitive, and where a parent will say, I want you to be happy, but the message is, if you don't go to 4 colleges that are in my head, you've somehow failed. And this is putting enormous pressure on some kids. And okay, next slide. Next slide. Yes, great, perfect. No, that slide. Don't move. Means Matters is out of the Harvard School of Public Health. Strongly recommend you all take a look at it. And it says, I wrote a book about my mom's suicide. Why? But really, it's what? And what we know is 60% of suicides are caused by guns. So even if you think you're from a district where it's liberal, without naming the district that I've worked in, and families don't have guns in these kind of liberal crunchy granola districts, be cautious, because sometimes kids will go to grandparents' houses and access guns. And so you always want to ask your kids about guns. I recently wrote for a local NPR about the horrible situation that happened with the 6-year-old boy who shot his teacher. Probably all of us had that sinking feeling when we heard about it. And the statistics are stunning. There are 30 million children in the United States that live in a home with a gun. And parents often think that they don't know where they keep the guns. And one study said that 40% of children could correctly identify where guns were, and nearly as many admitted handling their parents' guns. So if you're giving an in-service to parents, can you please pass on that statistic? It's a really important statistic. And some schools have actually, in response to that, started to give gun locks away as a way to just, make sure kids are safe. So, there's always the question about, next slide, the overlapping of suicide attempts um, and um, and cutting, and 3 to 13% of suicide attempters eventually die by suicide. So I know a lot of us have been taught about the idea that if you cut, it doesn't necessarily mean that, and I'll talk about that later, that you are suicidal. There is overlap, so keeping that idea of assessing around suicidality and level of despair is really important. Next slide. If ask about suicidal feelings, this is more really for you. This is if you borrow this for parents, telling parents not to be afraid of asking about suicide. And if you all haven't read Sue Kleinbald's book, A Mother's Reckoning, she was Dylan Kleinbald's, did you read it? Yes. Was it a good book? It's a gripping book, you guys. That's Dylan Kleinbald's mother of the Columbine. And she writes grippingly about how he had depression and despair that she hadn't recognized. And she really does it as a way, as a wake-up call for parents. And I found for me as an educator about, parents being under siege and not always seeing the details. Oh, she did TED Talk too, you said, so if you're not a reader, thank you. Another startling statistic as I was preparing for you all is only 25% of peers where a peer is confided to them that they're suicidal. Only a quarter of them tell an adult about their peer's suicidality. So that is a really important statistic. Just yesterday, I was called about a completed suicide in a school. And peers spoke to a counselor after the child had died by suicide. Family member talked after that it didn't surprise them. So we have a job to do, you guys. We have a job to create a school climate where it doesn't feel punitive. It doesn't feel like you're snitching if you share. And Quaglia, Quaglia, has a quick and dirty question you can ask as a school climate question. He looked at 50,000 kids from all different kinds of schools. And he said to the staff, do you think that a student is going to come and tell you if they have a problem? Almost 90% said, yeah, I think I'm approachable. I think a student's going to come talk to me. Guess what it was for students? 50%. And what they said is the telling important thing, and this is a take home for you to bring to your teachers. It was the teachers who made them feel like they were interested in who they were, not how they were doing in class. And that opened the door. And we all know those kind of teachers, right? We know the English teachers who end up getting the composition that talks about having suicidal thoughts. But it's an encouragement for us to really try to add nutrients and to sustain our teachers so they can maintain an interest in our kids' lives. Next slide. This is a questionnaire which I actually included in the references that I gave to you all. It's from Jobes, Jobes, who talks about collaborative, it's not Ross Green stuff. It's about sort of how do you think about suicide and how do you build a plan with patients. And this is the important take-home point with this one. If you look at it, it's around psychological pain, which is all about DBT, right? Dialectical behavioral therapy is about the pain's intolerable, so I'm going to do something impulsive and trying to increase kids' distress. And then, but the take-home point is around agitation. That's something that I missed in a almost completed suicide, was a kid who was agitated. And one of my child fellows, when I was presenting some of this on Monday, said to me, well, what do you mean by agitation? And what we mean is like an internal engine running. and a kid that can't stop moving, and uh, trouble sleeping, restless. And I had this teenager who I was trying to think about starting medication because her depression was really bad. I overlooked the idea that she'd been depressed before 12, possibly bipolar. She had a dad that was substance abusing. And she said a chilling thing, which is I would tie a rope around my neck, but I'm afraid that the rope would break. But then she reassured me up and down that she wasn't going to act on it. This was just the level of depression. I didn't pay attention to my feeling of dread. And we figured out the medication that might be helpful. And she went home and almost made a lethal attempt. And what I wish I had paid more attention to was the agitation. So just a signal to you guys to think a lot about that. And self-hate. So that's a really hard one to tease out, but NEFF, N-E-F-F, has a website called selfcompassion.org. She has a lot of short recordings on how to do meditations, on how to increase self-compassion. Teaching patients, students, how to have self-compassion is almost as effective as a medication trial. So I can tell you, when I sit with patients and I hear the vitriolic self-hate that they have, it is toxic for a therapist to sit with. And inevitably, sometimes what we end up doing is trying to talk them out of it. I've been doing a lot of work now with internal family systems, and what I can tell you is that better to invite the self-hate into the room and get to know it and make friends with it and find out how long it has been there, and then start the healing process. All right, so selfcompassion.org was the one, though, that I was telling you about that has the videos. Non-suicidal, I've got 5 minutes, you guys. Non-suicidal self-injury, we know that 15 to 20% of teenagers engage in self-injurious behavior. And, okay. I'm gonna tell you about, hold on, I need to grab. I'm gonna give you a situation, and I'm gonna ask you, what you would say. So and this is a real case, but the identity's been blurred. Our school nurse and principal asked me to reach out to share information and consult with you. So I want you all to be consultants, okay? Earlier today, we'll call this patient Michael. Michael's a transgender male, came to see our nurse with about 17 cuts on his leg. Michael said he made the cuts to get relief from anxiety over going to classes upstairs today and over the possible ending of a discord friendship. Michael was absent this week on his birthday and also said it's hard being back in school. Michael said that he flushed the razor in the bathroom where he did the cutting during the school day. The school principal, nurse, and I met and took Michael to the hospital to possibly get stitches, as our school nurse thought one of the cuts in particular might require a few stitches. The administrator said that he is sweeping the house constantly for sharps and would reach out to you, the therapist as well. Obviously, cutting has been ongoing for Michael. In the short term, as a school team, so this is you all, you're the school team, we are looking for any consultation from you regarding plans for Michael during the school day that can keep him safe and more comfortable and able to access school. So take a minute, take 3 minutes, you guys, talk with each other and designate one person who's going to tell me one thing that you think we should do. Easy case. Sorry. And for those of you that are on Zoom, you can do breakout rooms, and you could, we're going to take like 3 or 4 minutes. And then if they put their answers in the chat, and Um, Amy, Amy, if you're able to read from the chat, those that you think I should, if the people in the chat in the Zoom rooms can actually put in some suggestions, then Amy will read them, the ones that seem like they're going to build. Okay, and she's going to go to the different tables. No. Okay. Oh, I see. You're going to use it for back there. Then got it. Okay, woohoo! All right, you guys. Hello. Who knows how to make a whistle? Jeff, come on up and make a whistle. Okay, can I have Kelly come up? Can I have Nancy come up? Can I have Bill come up from Reading? Bill, Reading. Alyssa, come on up. Brandon, no, Brendan wasn't coming up from Haverhill, but you guys were going to make a decision. Who's coming? Okay, come on up. Stephanie from Beverly and Sarah from Malden. Thank you. And Jeff. Okay, so. All right, you guys. This is our moment, you guys. I just need your eyes up ahead. Hi. Did I forget anybody who volunteered? God bless you. Volunteered, begged. Zoom people, you're so happy you stayed at school. We love them though, right? Okay, so this is an opportunity for me to be Oprah. I'm going to ask each person what they're going to do, okay? And we're going to learn from them. And I'm going to be scribbling as they say it, because I bet you they have something to teach me. Not to put too much pressure on you guys. Welcome. I didn't tell you guys, I did a one-woman show called Regeneration. So I am a complete ham. No, it was a very sad story, though. It was actually, but it's the hardest thing I have ever done. I have no memory, and I memorized an hour. So hard. Okay. Stephanie, right? Hi, Stephanie. Can you share with us what you would do to help this student?
Yes, so some of the ideas that we came up with were having morning check-ins with the student, also collaborating with the parents and outside support, such as their community-based therapist or psychiatrist, if possible. Assuming that the student had this issue that had been ongoing, perhaps they had already been to some sort of programming, like a partial program, so collaborating with them for aftercare, and possibly doing body checks, which would be facilitated through the nursing staff at the school with parental permission, of course. And also because the child is in an at-risk category by being a transgendered youth, we would want to refer them to NAGLI or their school GSA. And those were the main points that we came up with.
Can we give a hand, you guys? That's beautiful. Thank you. And if you guys do not know Jeff Perotti, Perrottii, I hear someone nodding their head that he's wonderful. Shout out to him. He has a website. He does consultations to schools for free around, so this would be the type of student, because it's a transgender male, where you might be able to reach out and say, you know, maybe, let's just riff on this a little bit, maybe the student was triggered not because of friendship, but because a teacher had misgendered or called them their death name, and that had unraveled them. And maybe partly what you need to be thinking about is how to do an in-service to help support the staff in the transition that they're being asked to do around supporting transgender kids. Thank you. Okay.
But Bernie McCann, many of the same things. I think the first thing we talked about too, though, is sitting down with Michael and finding out who his go-to person would be, you know, who he's most comfortable with. A lot of similar things, having him check in with the nurse, potentially for some, you know, checks, having him being able to work with the social workers or guidance counselors, school counselors in the building. One other thing also, finding the comfort level of sharing with his teachers, because again, if he's going to be going up to class, sometimes again, knowing who this person is, not just what he's doing in the classroom, so they can identify if he's a little off, seems to be maybe not himself, and so they can help identify some of the things that may lead to another trigger for him.
Nice. So maybe even doing a functional behavioral assessment kind of thing of thinking about what would happen. One thought I had, and again, you all probably know this, but hats off to secretaries. There are some amazing secretaries who may end up actually being point person for a lot of our kids, just as we talked about a school nurse sometimes is a point person. So really, and again, you probably already do this, but being really mindful and creative in inventory of who are the people that sustain a child. Because really all you need, according to a Surgeon General and Bob Brooks, and is one charismatic adult. So that's sometimes, and you all might have heard about this, but in terms of doing violence prevention, sometimes what people do is they actually put all the names of the students, all the names of the staff, and then they do a check about who's had contact, and they figure out who are the students that are getting overlooked. After Sandy Hook, which some of you might have just been born then, but 2012, no insult, I just meant that I'm older than most of you in the room. Not everyone, thank you. But after 2012, there was a fourth grade teacher who actually looked at the connections in the classroom and was able to identify the kids that were marginalized. And the way she figured it out was asking the kids, who would you invite for lunch? And what we know is with sociograms that it's the marginalized kids, when they're marginalized, that weakens the community. So any way that we can sort of figure out about those silent kids that are under the radar, that may be depressed and suicidal, but they haven't externalized it, I think is really important. Okay, we have someone from Reading, in case you didn't notice, Reading Track and Field. Billy, right?
Bill.
Bill.
Or Billy, I guess. I don't know, either one. I am from Reading. I teach in Linfield, though. So we came up with an idea to create a team. We said communication is important. My wife tells me the same thing. So it's kind of important to include not only the counselors, but the teachers as well, just in case it comes up during class. This individual needs to go see a trusted adult in the building or a guidance counselor, so that the teacher understands not to make a scene and ask why they need to go, and just to let them go. So that's important. And then finding out more about the anxiety, especially linked to the friendship that was mentioned that was possibly ending, and maybe digging into that a little bit with the team of adults. You're welcome.
I love that you credit your wife for having learned about communication. One thing I thought about too, Bill, when you said it, was about having a nonverbal sign. That's a really important thing. We think about that with elementary school kids, and we sometimes forget with our high school kids about how hard it is to navigate. And some people have a card that they might put on the side of their desk, but thank you for bringing that. Melissa.
Yes, I'm Alyssa. So we talked about a lot of the things I think that have been mentioned. Two things that I don't think are a repeat. One is just trying to talk to the student to understand their understanding of their self-injury. So do they know when that might be happening? Like, are they able to identify that to help build a plan around that? So sometimes it's more impulsive and kids don't really know. And so helping them kind of identify those signs and maybe new coping skills that they could be using at school. And then the other thing was just a safe space in the building. So sometimes it's hard. We don't always have those available to us, I think. But if there's a place the student knows that they can go, when they're feeling overwhelmed or they feel like they're needing to do that. And so, who can they see and where can they go in the building?
So can you share with us some of the creative places you may have come up with for safe space?
Yeah, so I work at Somerville High School, and we have... Yeah, so the building is beautiful. We have community spaces, so each student is part of a community, and so that space is often a place that we use. We do it's usually full. Like we have a lot of students that need to go to that space. And so sometimes that's challenging because it's not really a private spot. So if you have a student that's looking for an individual space, like we might use the nurse. If the adjustment counselor or somebody is available, we'll use their space. But if anybody has any ideas, we get stuck a lot on where to put kids.
Any ideas here? Do we have, one thing I was thinking about yesterday when I was talking to the person who told me about the completed suicide, and one of the things that they were doing more of in reaction to the completed suicide was having times that students would walk together, like they would designate a time when students could go on a walk together, or having sort of times when people came together to have a snack as sort of a community building thing. But we were saying, wow, why does that have to happen after a suicide? And just sort of thinking about, one of the things I think a lot about is, oops, sorry. Are we getting it wrong? Are we so focused on mental health interventions and we're not thinking enough about the community and how we strengthen the community? And so our kids are oscillating and reflecting the fact that our community is frayed. And
Yeah, just one thing I would just say to that is I would love to do, and in a high school setting, I think it's super hard. We don't do groups. It's really hard to make that happen with the schedule. But so we always only talk to these kids individually about the things that are going on. And so it's very hard for them to understand that they're not alone. So that would be something I think would be great to incorporate more.
In my prior life, I did an advising program in the school that I worked at, and we had 2,000 kids, 200 groups. And the first day that back before your time, Devin, the first day that we had, one of the biggest worries that the staff had was that if we bring kids together, they're actually going to shut down. Oh, no, sorry. We bring kids together, they're going to tell us too much. And they convinced me of it because I hadn't done this before. And I actually had a hotline to DCSF. I'd called them to say we might, guess what happened? What happened was, first of all, which was really touching, is all of the Dunkin' Donuts in the surrounding area were out of donuts because all the staff had gone to buy donuts for their first group. And the second thing that they wrestled with and we did professional development with was silence. That kids actually took a little bit of time to trust. But there were some really moving ways that kids were able to support each other, and advising went out of flavor. That was 1996 that I worked on it. I worked on it for 6 years. I did an evaluation for the school committee, blah, 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 training for the 200 staff. And then it just sort of vanished. Maybe some of you will tell me, some of the smaller schools have held on to it, but the larger schools, and that so much to me reminds me of the flavor of the month mentality that we often have in schools, that we can chase the money. The grants sort of fuel the interventions, and then the grant money goes away and we might end up shifting. So, okay, can you share?
Yeah, so our group basically talked about similar things, but one thing we really focus on is having a re-entry safety plan where Michael would really ease into the transition to going back to the classroom. So maybe Michael will just start off with having 1 or 2 classes in the beginning, and then gradually that will lead into like a half day, like classroom setting, so that there's not this academic pressure, but really focusing on like the mental well-being. And I think just as others have shared, like communicating with teachers and helping Michael identify a safety network, like within the school building, whether it's like friends or teachers or just someone that Michael could feel really comfortable talking to.
Thank you. Do you have the BRIGHT program in your school, the BRYT program? Okay, so can you explain to folks the BRIGHT program and sort of maybe?
I also work at Somerville High School, but I'm going to have my wonderful school adjustment counselor here.
So we have the Bridge program, which is, I think, modeled after the BRIGHT program, but when students are hospitalized for a reason and outside of school for a period of time, or in situations like Michael, they don't necessarily have to be hospitalized, but maybe they're at risk. And we, go through the process. And then the Bridge program is a space in our building that has tutoring, and so students ease back in. So they can go to one class that they feel comfortable with, and they can spend the rest of the day in Bridge, or we kind of build individualized schedules for students, part of that program. And, it's the thought is that it's sort of a short-term bridge back into school to help them sort of ease that process.
So, how many people in here have a program like that? That's amazing, you guys. Oh, Bright's going to be so excited. So, for those of you who don't have it, BRYT, there's actually, and I included it, a two-pager about the programming of it in the handouts that I sent to Margie. And there's actually evidence that shows if you have a program like that, if for those of you who do need to advocate, you don't have it in your school? You do? Oh, excuse me. Oh, okay. Go Somerville. Okay, sorry. That if you don't have it, they're really good in helping school districts figure out how to advocate for having that kind of resource, because it does decrease the number of hospitalizations, and it can help with kids not showing up in special ed because they get the concentration on reentering. Okay, Nancy, we have my namesake here. I am her.
We talked about all of these things. The first thing we said that we noticed, though, was that he had said he flushed the razor, and we all didn't believe that. So we said we would search him, because we've had that happen before at our school, something similar. And, the student insisted they had thrown away the razor, and probably 4 different people had to really compel him before he admitted he actually still had the razor. So we finally gave it up. And yeah. We've been around the block a few times. So, and we also, like everyone talked about, identifying a safe person in the building, even if we don't necessarily have the safe place, just the safe person that's the connect for that student that student feels comfortable with going to. We're from Saugus. One of the things we do sometimes, luckily not often, but sometimes families really don't want us to share with the teachers much or anything. So we do a handle with care. So we'll send out an email to the team that works with that student and say, this is a handle with care situation, so that they understand there's something going on, whether it's in the family or with the student directly, that's more psychology based, and to, kind of just handle with care and reach out to the counseling staff and the nurse and the people working with the students if they need anything.
Guys, do you see why I love teaching? Because I'm learning. I bet you that's one thing you all will take home to your districts, handle with care. Because a place where that really can come up with is when there's a completed suicide, the kids know it, the staff know it, but they're not given permission to talk about it because the parents don't give permission. And that is one of the hardest, gut-wrenching times. I've seen it happen twice, and that I haven't come up with an easy solution. It's actually just one of those that is sort of a sticky solution, because you talk about double talk, right? You're not able to grieve as a community, or you want to grieve as a community, but you can't quite figure out the language to do it. And if anybody has had an amazing experience where they troubleshooted that and was able to do it, I'd be in awe to hear about it. Anybody? No? Okay. All right.
A quick shout out to Julie Cahill O'Shea watching online. We appreciate you being here. I'm coming from an assistant principal perspective. I'm a big operational guy, so I'm sort of building off of the razor blade that was brought up. I think an important part of the ongoing plan would be to potentially do checks and bag checks, as well as checking in with the family. I'd also want to do an inventory in my building as to where these sorts of materials may be in our building, without necessarily sharing the information, but knowing for myself, sort of then doing a cross-reference with the student's schedule where they are in the building, and making sure that that accessibility is decreased as much as possible.
That's a great one. That's a good one. I wouldn't have, that's a very preventative move. It's really cool. Hello.
Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm from Malden.
Hi, Sarah from
Hello.
Malden. Malden was a place I worked at back about 15 years ago. Like 25 years ago.
Veronica was-
Papafos. I used to do a Mad, Bad, Sad lecture. And I'm so happy you're here.
Well, thank you. I'm happy to be here. So I don't have a lot more to add. I do like that idea with Somerville. I apologize, I don't remember your name. But what are the triggers? What was the antecedent? And having those check-ins. So we really talked about a safety plan, doing morning check-ins, sort of if the parents or guardians were cooperative, how did they leave the house in the morning? Let's start there before they even walk in the door, just to make an assessment. So also exploring the social isolation, trying to build community with outside of the school in addition to inside the school. We don't have a bridge program, but we were talking about sort of the academic demands and sort of how do we reduce those to make the school day more tolerable.
Thank you. One thing I would say, just, and I'm wearing both hats now, but sometimes what I see is schools decrease the academic demands, but they don't increase the skill level. So you end up having a kid that's sort of warehoused, where the expectations keep going down, but the kid isn't getting to practice. So I have, at the Harvard School of Mental Health, I have a wonderful woman who you should try to get, Margie. Her name is Miriam Kadoust, Khadoust, and she's going to be talking on perfectionism. So perfectionism, I just listened to her lecture. She's giving it February 4th, but one of the things that I learned about it is lots of times what happens is schools say, let's extend the time. Since you're so frazzled, maybe you ended up cutting, and and she said that's actually counterproductive for a kid who has perfectionism, because they end up just having the deadline. Like, usually what happens is the deadline comes, in a moment of panic, they push through the perfectionism and they're like, just hand it in. If you move the goal, then the perfectionism stuff starts all over again. So it's more actually looking at the thoughts that get them stuck, and then working with them to challenge it. So in my talk that I did with school avoidance, that's another aspect that I think about. A lot of times we're trying to figure out, like, when do you say behavioral activation, just get in the building and we don't care what you do? And then when do you decide, are you going to pass fail a kid? Or when are you going to start increasing the expectations? And I think it's really important for us as educators to keep track of what are the skills that we're building, so we can start thinking about incrementally increasing the expectations. Okay. Oh my gosh, it's 11:15. So 5-minute break. Come on back. I'll have, hold on. Oh wait, there's some Zoom people. Can I look at what the Zoom people have to say while these guys are taking a break, and we'll come back. Okay. And then I have a 4th grader that we're going to be thinking about together.
So we're here to help. Good to have you. Yes, it is a work in progress for sure. I will definitely say that. And so we're willing to assist, because we just can't handle the 1,600 students that apply to come here every day. And so that means that we need to do something differently across the Commonwealth in educating our youth and making sure that they are prepared for life, not college, life. And so, yes, go ahead, clap, because it is so true. And so we're here to help. I think we're not competitors in this world of education. We all need to come together and think about the students first. So I hope you enjoyed your fruit and so you got a combination of really unhealthy, buttery Danish, but to complement that is some nice fresh fruit. Some of the greens are actually grown in our greenhouse, so at lunchtime, I believe some of the salads, we have a production greenhouse, and we donate all of the excess produce in the summertime to Salem Public Schools for their programs. So we work very closely with Salem as well. Food security is critical, and as an agricultural school, we need to make sure that kids know where our food comes from, but how can we actually produce food in cities in order to get that healthy food? Because pretty basic, right? Maslow's hierarchy of needs, food, shelter, that hasn't gone away. And so we need to make sure that we're helping those kids as well access that. So thank you for even coming. And I think Marjorie, she is like, oh yeah, I mean, there's no stopping her. So she's somewhat relentless, which that's probably why we get along so well, because Senator Lovely the other day called me, you're tenacious. I'm like, I don't know how I should take that, but I'll take it as a compliment. I know, but so if you need anything, we're here to help. We can't thank you enough. It is a beautiful space here. Yes, we have a gorgeous, beautiful space across the hall or across the street as well, but there's nothing like sitting in a 1913 building. So we're excited to host you. Enjoy lunch. If you need anything, we're here to help. And thanks again for choosing us, because we appreciate it.
Yay. Okay, awesome. I'm giving Chris Willard, who's going to be our next speaker, showed up, and he is a very close colleague of mine. We run the Harvard School Mental Health Conference in February, and I said after, I asked him, will you just help us with, like, I would love us to do like a movement break one, Chris, anything. But first, I'm just going to say what the Zoom folks told us. One thing they said that I thought was really smart. How many of you have teachers who say, I don't have a copy of the IEP. I often don't get the information that I need. So one thought they had around the reentry program is really focusing on how quickly can you distribute the information. If you have a Handle with Care memo, does it get printed and brought in an envelope, or does it go by email? Like, how do you get it out quickly? Because that's a common thing I hear of people struggling with. And then another Zoom participant talked about, and I remembered a wonderful custodian at the school district I worked with too, and she talked about an awesome custodian who took kids under his wing and would have them do projects around the school. And then Sarah from Malden talked about when she has kids, one of the upsides of the pandemic is now we all have Google Chrome and access sometimes into the classroom. So as part of the transition, tell me if I'm saying it wrong, with especially a school avoidant kid, you can get them started on the work in your office, and so that they don't have to feel like they're behind, and then they have more reason to not get into the classroom. Did I say it right? Yes, cool, okay. And the last thing I wanted to say, for those of you who aren't familiar with Barry Walsh, Barry Walsh does a lot of in-services on self-harming behavior, and he really encourages schools to have a protocol. The takeaway with the school protocol, I'm shrinking what is a 4-hour in-service, but one of the important takeaways is having in the school behavioral, whatever, the booklet, something about when people have cut that they need to wear long, they need to basically cover them up, because that can cause a contagion if you have kids who cut and then are, flaunting isn't the right word, but showing their distress and then making it happen. So another thing important for you to think about. So we are going to have another case of a 4th grader, but I'm going to ask Chris if you could just come on up, and I can never do these in front of 80 people, but Chris is like a wizard at this, just to get us into our wise mind when I throw a pretty hard case at you guys of a 4th grader. Come on up.
That's a big promise.
God bless Chris. We love Chris.
Great to see everybody. Do you want to do something standing?
I think standing.
All right, let's just stand up and just have a little bit of a stretch. So it's great to be here, and I apologize for rolling in right now. I had some stuff in the morning. It's great to see everybody, but let's just take a few minutes just to stretch. You can just lift up one arm. And I like this little, actually get on the stage, this little practice of stretching. My friend calls this circles. You can start just making a little circle with your finger, and then a circle with your whole hand and wrist, backwards and forwards, and some circles with your arms. And we can try our other arm, finger, a few fingers, and wrists. We've got our elbows and our arms. And we can move our whole bodies in circles. Maybe one foot. If you don't fall over, other foot. Oh, I'm going to fall over on this foot. And we can just find a settled spot in the middle. And you can just sit back down and let's just enjoy a few breaths. just noticing that you're sitting at first, maybe noticing your feet on the ground, your legs and back against the chair. Noticing also how nice it is to be together here in person, not on Zoom.
Some of us are.
Some of us are on Zoom. I'm so sorry, I just got here. Sorry, everybody on Zoom.
You got distracted.
And you can just enjoy a few breaths, just breathing in, feeling the sensations. And breathing back out, enjoying those sensations. And taking a moment just to appreciate that we are all here in person or on Zoom doing this great work for kids, this hard work for kids in this epidemic of mental health. And I'll just pass it back to Nancy.
Thank you.
Sure.
Awesome. Chris goes all over the world teaching people how to meditate, and we got to have him just now, or mindfulness, sorry. I just hit this, I don't know why.
Yeah, turn that off, sorry.
Okay. Cool, thanks. Can you hear me? So are we back with our slides yet? I don't see them. While we're waiting, we're going to go to the DBT skills in schools. How many of you are familiar with the MAZA DBT in schools? One person. Can you tell us, or two people, can you tell us a little bit about what DBT in schools is? Come on up. Thank you. What's your name?
Corey.
Corey. God bless Corey. for
Hi.
coming up.
So I did a 2-day training last year, and just learning about how to implement more.
DBTs in schools, if you can go to that book. Sorry, I'm just trying to.
And then I bought the book, and I haven't had time to open it and go through it and actually try to implement. So I don't know how much more I can say about it, but it was really helpful and interesting to figure out how to implement or work towards implementing smaller DBT groups and how to utilize the skills within the school, as opposed to just kind of like throwing things at a wall and seeing what sticks. So it's a really helpful book. It's not that expensive, and hopefully I'll have time this year to highlight a few more things in it.
Thank you. But I actually think you're so honest, right? I went to a 5-day workshop on DBT skills with Alec Miller, and you have to have an incredible commitment to take on these skills. And sometimes it's like, I keep still looking up the skills. I will share when we get to one case, one that I really think everybody should have. But the other thing about the DBT in schools is they have a really good YouTube, both for DBT in schools, which has select skills. And they have a DBT for parents. So if you look up that on YouTube, just put in DBT in schools, MAZA, M-A-Z-Z-A, and it'll pop up. So next slide. Those are all the DBT skills on the next slide and how daunting that is. Just talking about screening tools, of course, we all know this, but those kids who have depression often have trauma, and how important it is to do an upsetting event survey. And is this off? Nope. Upsetting events survey and PTSD. And in the next slide, so go to screening tools next, and that was where I was talking about just the differential with depression. And then if you go to the next slide, psychosis risk screening. Sometimes I see kids who come in, and particularly with our older high school students, where it's prodromal, meaning that the psychosis, it's almost like if you think about with Alzheimer's, sometimes folks who have Alzheimer's end up being depressed before they have the symptoms of Alzheimer's. With psychosis, I think when kids begin to sort of know that there's some loosening that's happening, they look depressed. And so I gave you all the questionnaire, the prodromal questionnaire, but do familiar surroundings sometimes seem strange or confusing, threatening or unreal to you? Do you worry at times that something may be wrong with your mind? Have you seen things that other people can't see or don't seem to see? And the Cedar Clinic is an incredible resource for those of you all that don't know about it, cedarclinic.org, which provides both diagnostic assessment for free because it's part of research efforts, diagnostic interventions, and psychosocial interventions and medication interventions, and is a really good resource for families that are willing to access that. And one of the things that they show that I think is really interesting is that antidepressants actually in a first break can be enormously helpful if you can catch it in the prodromal period. So that's a point of hopefulness. Okay, I am going to skip some of these because I want to make sure we get to, because we now have 25 minutes, right? Yes, 11:30? Yeah, okay. So all of these are self-explanatory. I'm going to go to Nabil, who is, I really wanted to make this case-based learning, you all. I think we can learn a lot from each other. So I'm going to tell you about this 10-year-old, and then I'm going to ask a really important question to you. How would you outreach to this family as I'm explaining this case? So we're going all the way to slide 47, Nabil, N-A-B-I-L. How would you outreach to this family? And what kind of accommodations would be helpful to this student? Okay? So let me tell you about the 10-year-old, and then I'm going to ask a different person if they will come up with me, and we'll have a discussion about it. So we're going to power through it and do it. You have to think really fast because we're doing it in about 5 minutes, because I also have a video that I want to show of me talking with a really escalated teenager. So we're going to do this for 5 minutes, and then we're going to talk quick for 5 minutes, and then we're going to move to the teenager, okay? So this is rapid dating. Let me just tell you the case, and as I'm reading it, I want you to think about what would you do. Nabil is a 10-year-old recent Syrian immigrant who's a fourth grader in a mainstream classroom who receives ELL support. There's a new word for ELL now. Pardon? Oh, MLL, thank you. I have to correct that, but okay. His teachers worked hard to build a relationship with him, including coloring and chatting together at the beginning of the school day while the rest of the class reads. Reward systems for behavior and work production have been working, but he still has many outbursts that are concerning to his teacher. Yesterday, he ran away from MLL classroom and pounded on his classroom window so hard that another teacher had to come out and intervene. When he entered the classroom, he threw books, shoved desks, broke markers, and screamed at his teacher, including, "I hate you," and "Mrs. Cracker." An aide took Nabil out of the classroom for a walk to calm down, and some of the statements he made to her further concerned his teacher, including that she had told the class she didn't like him, and that in his parents' country, when students don't like their teacher, they tell their parents, and the parents phone the police and remove the teacher. So next time she makes him mad, he will tell his parents and get her arrested. He also told her that his teacher locks her door because she doesn't want him there. The teacher explained that the door is locked for safety in case bad people come into class, and she has repeatedly told him that she likes having him in the class, and so she perceives this as unfounded on his part. I tell you this case, this is a real life case. I was out in Seattle, and I was teaching similar to what we were doing here, but I was talking about an escalated kindergartner from the behavior code. And a principal raised her hand and she said, "I just got a notice from a teacher that she's thinking about leaving, and this is the situation she's dealing with." So I'll tell you what we came up with and how it all ended, but I'd love for you to take 5 minutes, think really quickly how you want to respond to this kid. There's the cheat sheet, and we'll talk quickly about that. want us to cover. So I just was listening, and what I want you to do is if there's something I missed, just raise your hand, and I'll repeat it for the Zoom people. First of all, outreach to parents is something I heard you all talking about, and I think an important thing I learned from the Children's Hospital emergency room outreach is really thinking when you talk to parents about observable behavior and interventions that have been put into place. Oftentimes we call and we say, you need to, come pick up your kid. Maybe none of your school districts do that, but that happens. And there's not the detail about the observable behavior that might have happened. And I wanted to highlight that there were substantive things that the teacher had done. And that's really important. A teacher like this gets so demoralized. And we have to be thinking about when we have those high-risk kids in the classroom that are taking up 90% of the energy of the teacher and beleaguering the other students. What are we doing to fortify? Dan Hughes talks about tapping in. So I know, sir, what's your name again, the administrator? Jeff. I know Jeff's an administrator. Sometimes it might be actually concretely designating someone else beside the teacher that goes into that classroom for half hour a day as a way of recognizing that they need a break, that it's especially in the elementary school ages when it can be relentless. And Dan Hughes uses the language about tagging in, and I think that's an important discussion for staff to have, to know that there are times when we go, like we talked about before, from collaboration to control, and just creating a culture where it's okay to tap in and relieve someone without it being like a whole discussion, just, hey, I'm coming in. And what the teacher had done, I thought that were important, building on Robert Pianta's work about enhancing relationships between teachers and students. She was banking time. And I like that idea, like I tell parents 5 minutes a day. He says 10 minutes, the research, but I go for 5 minutes a day that you can spend with your child where you're not making a demand. And particularly with the younger oppositional kids where they're the boss, and just, drop the rope. And I think the idea of thinking, I heard some people talk about, he actually felt the coloring that he was doing, which she thought as a way of connecting to him. Because he's a fourth grader, he thought that was demeaning. Because in his culture, he could read in his language. And so this idea that he was being asked to color made him think, she thinks I'm stupid. Another part was around, the significance of a locked door, depending on where you're coming from. I mean, well, we come from a crazy culture right now where we think we can actually bulletproof schools and lock doors rather than get rid of semi-automatic guns, but that's a whole nother discussion. But this idea that a locked door and giving him a sense of agency, maybe he's the one that locks the door and opens the door for the kids so that he has a sense of having agency. And another thing to just think about is being a cultural broker, and who in your school is the cultural broker. Now, sometimes when I've done this, people have said, well, we all should be cultural brokers. But I think we also have to have a level of cultural humility, and that we may not know the nuances. And I have made that mistake. I've done a safety assessment where a student was having an emerging psychosis, prodromal, and the family had decided for Ramadan they were going to bring her to the Mecca because that was what was going to cure her. And we were at an IEP meeting, similar, maybe Jeff, you would have been in that meeting. We were with an administrator, we were with the school psychologist, a group, because sometimes it can be 5 or 10 people. The mistake is we should have had a cultural broker there, not just a translator, but someone that they identified from their community that would have supported them in helping to try to translate the concerns that we had. And that Mecca is a great thing, but it might not work for this particular problem that she was having, which was increased aggression because of a prodromal hearing voices in her head. And so I just want to tell you what happened at the end. The principal actually, well, first what we did is we all took out our phones and we sent encouragement, but with the teacher's permission, to the teachers. So there was 200 of us in the room and we all sent her a message of support. So, and then the principal did a home visit with the Syrian family, a group of Syrian women, and she only met with the women, not the men. And the son actually joined them when at the end of the meeting, and she said he was impressed that I should know anything about their belief systems and customs. And then she wrote me, I followed this case for 18 months just to sort of check in and see what was happening. And she wrote me, our little Syrian boy is doing very well this year. He's taking on leadership roles at school like lunch monitoring. So that's the agency that we were talking about, Islands of Competency. I get monthly updates from his teacher. He's now in the same class as his sister, and she's keeping tabs on him. They also set up a alternate spot during lunch for Muslim kids during Ramadan. And she said, last weekend, I even ran into him at the park. I'm also thrilled that his teacher from last year has not only continued in the teaching profession, but has remained at the same school where there are significant challenges. So this is a call out to you guys in terms of we have to anchor our teachers, and what you're doing is incredibly important. Okay. Did I forget anything? Does anyone else want to add in? Yes, in the back, Amy says. Oops, but you don't have a thing here. If Margie's going to run back and give it to you. Where are you? Way in the back, Amy. Oh, it's Amy. And while you're doing that, we are going to, now, the next thing we'll be doing is showing the CNN piece.
Okay. Group 10 want to know if there's a trauma history triggering elopement. And they said, try to identify the trigger for elopement to set up environment to increase chance and the bill remains in the space, even if he's upset. And then we have one more comment. Breakout group 1 commented that there should be trauma-informed support for staff.
Yes, for the staff, I agree. Two thoughts I have about what you said. Certainly, when I presented this, someone pointed out Miss Cracker. Where did it come from? You know, was it a racist term? And you know, was it cracker versus crocker? Like, did he mispronounce it? And just being able to think about the elements of, you know, race and culture in a school setting. And I had a very, when I did this in a staff development, I had a very compelling story that someone shared that I just want to read to you for a second. I was working in a city school, and a student's father was in prison. His older brother was in a gang. He was in 4th grade. It made me associate when you said trauma. I would take him out, in my position, I would take him out in the community. We were in a museum, and he asked me to take him out because there were too many white people. We went out and took a break, and he was okay about going back in because we were going into a planetarium. On the way home, he was in the back of the van. I asked him about the need to leave. He shared a time where he was in a restaurant with his family and racial comments were made. He took me through his neighborhood and showed that this was where he felt safe. We talked about people's behavior versus their looks. I'm white, and I asked him why he was comfortable with me. He replied, "You're black." I said, okay, this was a turning point for both of us. So I don't know if we had more time, we could certainly unpack that, because I definitely don't think that we're in a race-blind culture. I think we carry, but it certainly was an opening to have a talk about the idea of what race and culture mean in our school settings and how important that is, particularly when we are now confronting more openly systemic racism and how we talk with our kids about that. While so we have 10 minutes. What I'm going to do, because we have 10 minutes, is ask, because these are really amazing things that you all shared with us. Angela, if you could come up. Aaron, if you were able to come up. 4, 5. And Lorraine and Nancy. I feel like we're in graduation. So, let me just see. Angela, hi. And then, okay, so it's Angela, Aaron, Lorraine, and Nancy. So do you need your piece of paper? Yes. Aaron, hi. And Lorraine, and Nancy. Okay. So you remember at the beginning, I asked you all to share turnaround moment. So just to orient you what we're going to be sharing, and very grateful to you all that you would. This is around a turnaround moment with an individual, and the end is around a turnaround with an individual student. It's a very upbeat one at the end. And this is more on a personal level, turnaround moments that you happened. And always, tomorrow I have 2 hours with a consultant who basically always tells me that as individuals, we have to sharpen our instrument. We have to take care of ourselves. And so that's why I feel very grateful to the two of you for sharing that. I feel grateful to you all. So Angela, if you could share.
Sure. Sure. So I am a GSA advisor and school psychologist at King Philip High School in Rentham. And I had a transgender student who was hospitalized in 9th grade. After that, he began to transition to male, and eventually became president of the GSA and came off of his IEP and ended up going to Mass Art for college. So really saw a huge transformation in him.
All of us have clinical experiences where when we're sitting with, like that 13-year-old that we were hearing about before, who's cut and brought in a razor and is transgender male, holding on to a story like this, you all might have a different story, but, where's my, I was saying, holding on to stories like this, that's where, for those of you who are younger than some of us in the room, start storing up the clinical cases that actually turn around, because that will fuel you when you're sitting the next time with, say, a student like we were talking about, our first student, where you can see the light.
So this is a real personal story. So I went to my primary care physician and she looked at me and she said, "You look sad. Here's an antidepressant. It was called Remron." And I said, "Oh, I don't think so." I said, "I have a lot going on. You know, I've been really sick, in and out of the ICU. You know, I think I really don't need that." And she says, "Yes, you do. You need it. You need it." So she put me on it and I took it and increased, as she said. And after 6 weeks, I became suicidal and homicidal. And I had written letters to 8 people and put them all in envelopes, labeled them, made a plan, and was going to go down in my garage and start my car and decide to just end my life because I didn't know what else to do. And I stopped myself and I said, what has changed in 6 weeks to go from being this assistant principal that loves her job, loves her friends, loves her family, loves her kids? And I decided to Google Remron and ask myself, what this is the only change that I've done in 6 weeks. And lo and behold, one of the serious side effects is suicidal and homicidal ideations. So I didn't want to tell anybody, because if I told the doctor, what would they do? They would admit me into a psychiatric ward and there I would go and be labeled. So I took myself off it immediately and then went through the horrible side effects of withdrawal and was basically almost what I would consider like a mania for 4 days. I didn't sleep. I went to work. I didn't tell anybody. And it was like the 5th day when I got home. I looked at the letters and I said, okay, you can do this, Erin, you can do this. I fell asleep finally. I woke up on the 6th day and it was like this epiphany. And I went to work and my colleagues came up to me and said, you look really different. You're smiling, you're laughing, you're interacting with us. Something's different about you. And I finally confided in my surgeon at Mass General to tell her what had happened. And they list now Remron as a serious allergic reaction. So I'm very cognizant when many of my students are put on different medications and they start acting differently. So
that's a very, first of all, wait, before you switch, I just want to say how happy all of us are. Yeah, that you are still with us. Yeah, still with us and having clearly being a passionate educator, and you know that people don't always know when someone's struggling, and people will remember from here how important it is to educate our educators about, when you take a medication, particularly an antidepressant, and you have what I would wonder about whether it was bipolar switching because it was such a dramatic change in your personality, that's a 5-star alarm and that the psychiatrist or the internist needs to be notified. And also that you actually had a wise mind that said, I don't know if this is what it needs. I mean, sometimes internists are moving quickly, psychiatrists are moving quickly, and they get into a quick fix mode. And being an educator right now is hard. Being an assistant principal is hard. And there may not be medication around that. It might be the way that I talk about with us working with parents. It's sitting in the darkness with each other and having the faith that we will find the light. So
this was about 10 years ago. So
you're reassuring us that you're A-okay now. Yes.
I mean, I had significant medical history and had been septic 16 times. So I had a lot of things going on, and this doctor wasn't really interested in that part of my life. So
yeah,
thank you.
Well, great. We are so thankful.
Thank you. It's just funny that the story I'm about to tell is about my brother, and his name is Aaron, and it's interesting. I just always feel the universe conspiring when I hear the name Aaron or Aaron, and we just happen to be standing next to each other. So that's, yeah. So in 2007, 2008, I sort of deepened my understanding of the relationship between bipolar disorder, particularly the depressive symptoms of bipolar disorder, and substance use and abuse, and how sort of chronic drug use can be a method of self-medication. And it took the personal loss for me of my brother to really sort of put that together, even though I've been in the field of education and mental health for 22 years now. But at that time and after that, I've sort of prided myself on working with the clinicians that I work with every day so that another family doesn't have to experience that kind of loss.
If you were to say one sort of piece of advice you would give to a substance abuse teenager who might have a mood disorder, what would you say that would be?
I think that's hard to really think about. But when I think about my own brother and sort of when his substance abuse started, which was very, very early, age 12, and thinking about him in his teenage years and us sort of growing up together, and he was retained, which we don't do anymore, so we were in the same grade and graduated high school at the same time. I think I would say that, holding on to your personal connections. And I think giving them the advice that there's sort of nothing inherently wrong with them. And I think we know more now about the connections between the way our brains are wired and substance use and abuse. And I think we do understand it more now as a disease. But I think for him, he had two different things going on with, I think, untreated and undiagnosed bipolar disorder, and then the use of, drugs and alcohol to sort of medicate that. And I think that he could have used the message that there was nothing inherently flawed about him, and that sort of from the perspective of like his own self-worth was so damaged by the fact that he believed there was something wrong with him. And I think the earlier we can intervene and treat, the better.
Thank you, Lorraine. I was thinking when you were saying that Tom Joyner, who's written a book, Why People Die by Suicide, he's a researcher, big, tall football guy who lost his father to suicide and has gone on to be a fierce researcher. And one of the things he talks about when people become suicidal is the perceived burden. So that's a little bit of what you're saying. And so I will often encourage families in a family meeting to tell their child and be explicit how devastated they would be if they lost their child to suicide. Because sometimes the nature of depression is people think nobody's really gonna care if I die. And so many times when I've worked with families who have lost someone to suicide, what they say is, it's the what if. What if I'd had a chance to tell that person, how much I love them? So sometimes parents will say, well, I don't want to make them feel guilty. I'm like, hell yes. If making them feel guilty has them stick around, I'm good with that. And it can be extremely moving to be with families when they have an opportunity to tell their family member that. So, yeah. And so we have Nancy, and she is really going to highlight to me the idea of when you, not to steal your thunder, but when you intervene with a student, I don't know if many of you all are familiar with Ghosts in the Nursery, Selma Freiberg's piece, which was written back in the late 50s. I actually, anybody who wants to get a copy of it, I've got it on my hard drive. I can send you a copy. But it's really about the work that two therapists are doing back in the 1950s when people did home visits and spent a lot of time with families. And the question that I always talk about with my Harvard freshmen when they read it, I ask them, what do you take away from it? And one of the things that the therapists were struggling with is how come the mother doesn't hear the babies cry? Now, I have a grandson now. There is nothing that makes me more alert than when my grandson is crying. I'm like, yikes, what can I do? Anything, milk, diapers. And that question, when I'm working with suicidal families, one of the things that I ask the families is what has happened in your family that your child didn't come to ask you for comfort before they made a suicide attempt? So in the handout, you'll see there's a copy of the book, Attachment-Based Family Therapy. And my thought is that suicide happens either because in a family they are too far apart or they're too enmeshed. And I have now started doing work where if I'm going to do an antidepressant, I ask to have 8 visits with the family so that I can work on that dynamic. Because I'm usually not going to start an antidepressant unless a kid is suicidal. I mean, they might have other things, but that's the really compelling one for me. And then I want to be able to strengthen the family. So I thought your piece was a beautiful full circle about that.
It's a happy ending. So I had a student, I'm a middle school counselor, I have been for 21 years. And way back at the beginning of my career, I had a student who struggled with the transition to middle school. She had a really nice family, but they had some struggles in their home. And middle school proved to be very difficult for her. She had some trauma happen, and it cut really deep, and she developed a significant substance abuse problem as a result at an early age. But I always saw this light in her, and I always used to tell her, "You're going to be fine. Everything's going to be fine." And she would visit me when she was in high school, and we kept in touch, and she, would talk about her struggles, and I'd be like, "I don't know why I see it, but you're just going to be fine." And we continued to stay in touch. She went to recovery high school. She got clean and sober. And I think that might be where she met her now fiance. They had a baby. He and her came to the school. They brought the baby so I could meet the baby, and they talked to my students about substance abuse and how to avoid that. And now she's gone to college. They have been working really hard for several years. They purchased their first home. It's nicer than mine. I'm very happy for them. So it's been really wonderful to see that full circle for her. It's not the true story for all my students. I've had students go on and we've lost them to substance abuse. So it's been really a joy to watch her and her husband grow together and stay together and start a family and have a home and have a successful life. And I really enjoy keeping in touch with them. I think that, that's not true of all our students. It's a rare case, but it boosts my spirits when things get hard to know that I have some students out there who have really been a success story.
Thank you. Well, so that is a nice note to end our day together. And thank you again, you all, for showing up for our students and making a difference. And I'm here if you have questions afterwards. I'm not going to be leaving for another half hour, so happy to answer anything. Yeah. Thank you. And thank you. Thank you. Oh, you're welcome.